municipal training for the Village of Williamsville, neighborhood mixed use and R3M multiple dwelling residential design standards refresher course. Again, this was approved by the village board back on October 13th as continuing education credit for everybody on the committees. Oops, sorry, hang on. My computer's being annoying. So tonight, we're going to go a little bit faster than I did last time. I'm not going to spend nearly as much time developing a site plan as we did last time because the principles remain the same. Spend a little bit more time on the community plan tonight because I think it's important with these two individual chapters, and then run through and kind of do a comparison line for line almost for the various chapters so you can see how these things relate to one another. So quickly, the community plan. So the vision for the community plan was to create this neighborhood mixed use district, and it qualified a lot of things that wanted to address. It's indicated that at the time residents were very content with the existing residential neighborhoods, that it was important to focus on commercial and multifamily areas where change was not only expected but also desired in the village, and that the village should be set up to proactively manage that change as it occurred. A couple of the things that were important to the community plan at the time was that the established 1 and 2 family neighborhoods should be preserved, that they were deemed as central to the quality of life and a suitable alternative to the other suburban style subdivisions outside the village. There was a desire, however, to pursue new and varied housing beyond the confines of the 1 and 2 family dwelling and or the big box apartment. And in the comp plan, the NMU district roughly corresponded to the existing R3M at the time and any other existing multifamily developments, with the exception of South Long Street, which was commercial but was deemed desired to be redubbed. So as I said, location and character, it was primarily in the southwest and northeast portions of the village. So basically Evans and South Long, with a smattering of other places around that were already consisting of high density residential and were deemed appropriate for future residential development. Key characteristics that they identified with that mixed use would be multi-story buildings, consistent building edges, inviting ground floor facades, a mix of uses and architectural styles that were consistent with historic character and close proximity to those established residential neighborhoods. It also identified key components being suitable, well-designed, publicly accessible open spaces like parks and village streets that would be part of those developments. And it didn't really explain how that would be, and it didn't really quite make it to the standards. But that was sort of one of the principal underlying things they wanted to maintain. But the other key was that it was supposed to contain a mix of uses and spaces. It was supposed to be a true mixed use development, and it was meant to evolve over time at their own pace, building by building in response to changing lifestyles and needs. And I highlight that and underline that because this issue, this topic kind of regurgitates itself over and over and over again in various styles. But the most important part of this is that transition is meant to be over time, not necessarily space. So then the recommendation was to develop guidelines and zoning. So the village went about doing that back in 2010, 2015 time period. So before these zones, this is the map from 1996. And so we have these scatterings of R3M high density lots throughout the village, primarily existing apartment buildings that everyone's familiar with. So transitioning to the current code and making manipulations to that code, we adopted the mixed use district that we talked about last month. And so 4 of those properties just get scooped up into the mixed use because that now allows residential where previously the commercial did not. And then the idea was to scoop up that NMU district and grab everything that was multifamily. And one of the things that was done that wasn't talked about in the comp plan, but was done as part of the resolution, was to extend what had been the R3M zone, change its name to NMU, and stretch it southwards to encompass Blocher, because Blocher, interestingly enough, has always been multifamily, but has also always been in a single or two family zoning. The other thing it did is it created this NMU district down here in the South Long area that we've talked about recently. And then the last thing it did was it then modified and created a new design standard for the R3M zones. Those three that remain at Garrison, at South Long, and at the back of North Cayuga. And then it also added the R3M at the end of Union. It adopted an R3M zoning for the tennis center on Mill as an idea that that shouldn't be commercial anymore, and that in the future, should it ever turn over, what would we prefer it to be? The multi family made more sense. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, South Long Park, Lehigh Trail, and the Darling property, leaving us with what we have today. So proposed uses, like I said, it was intended to be a true mixed use, more than one use in the building, not necessarily requiring that mix of uses. You can have purely residential, but you couldn't have necessarily purely commercial or office. It was intended to increase that density of occupancy. It would ideally be situated relative to public nodes, and those residential buildings would have that street front commercial space, that sort of live work idea of olden times, and that there'd be setbacks that would respect those of the neighboring buildings, holding an even street face. And lastly, that off-street parking, of course, would be hidden behind the buildings, because everything says that, right? So then proposed density for a neighborhood mixed use was 1 to 3 stories. They stopped short of offering a specific suggestion with regards to a floor area ratio like they had in the mixed use. Mixed use had said 0.5 to 2.0. Neighborhood mixed use simply said an appropriate one should be developed that's consistent with the community's vision. Well, because the floor area ratio is an archaic, sort of older form of density calculation, the decision was made not to incorporate one, and therefore it was never really delved into, at least not documented wise, to be consistent with anything. But so for the purposes of our conversation tonight, I'd like to talk just quickly about what would that have been. And so I used Drexel Hill and Georgetown Apartments as an example. And so Drexel Hill is 156 units and on 10.4 acres. So that works out to roughly 0.28 floor area ratio. And Georgetown's 184 units on 11.8 acres, and that works out to 0.35. So for the purpose of the discussion, we're going to say that the average of the existing R3M at the time, which was supposed to become this new NMU, would have been 0.31. And so we're going to ask the question of whether 0.5 might be an appropriate range for that, seeing as that's the low end of the MU, and it's slightly more dense than what we currently have today. And so like maybe it's a happy medium. So we'll hold on to the idea of 0.5 for now, just as an example. So then it lists a whole bunch of design principles, which I'm not going to read for you, but they're the basic stuff. Cul-de-sacs are bad, and parking should be in the back, and transitions from existing lower density housing to higher density housing should be gradual. And this is where a lot of time was spent talking about that, so particularly in terms of Blocher, and I think to a lesser extent even with Asher Crossing. And I hearken back to that bolded statement where they talked about that transition of gradual over time, and I wonder if these statements about time versus space were ever really clearly defined, and maybe shouldn't be revisited. Step backs and circulation relative to pedestrians and things of this nature that are all consistent with the MU and kind of regurgitated into this format as well. So then the R3M. Now, the weird part about R3M in the comp plan is that it really isn't much of a reference to it, except to say that it's supposed to be eclipsed by NMU. The weird part is that if you read the residential portions of the comp plan, it actually uses R3 as the name of what is really an R3M at the time that it was written. So it's very confusing why they did that, and we think they may have kind of missed the boat when they wrote it. But basically, they use R3 as the term, even though they are actually referring to R3M. But they acknowledge that these are small areas scattered through the village. Like on that map, you saw it was half a dozen locations kind of smattered about. But they were really focusing on the idea that it provided this flexibility for deinstitutionalization of elder care, the idea of aging in place, that an existing long-term homeowner doesn't have to vacate the village to live here, that they could instead just simply downsize. And we needed a larger inventory of those types of institutions to provide them the opportunity to have that downsizing while still living in the village and staying in the place that they love. So again, they list these key components as primarily being these well-designed, publicly accessible spaces, and this idea that you might have this private development with public occupancy on it. Character-wise, it regurgitates again a lot of the same thoughts from the NMU and from the MU. The one thing they do is they talk about the South Long Street neighborhood as this focus area, and this idea that it was meant to convey the principles that they wanted the R3M of the, I'm sorry, that the existing R3M and potential new R3M could embody. So quickly diverging into that South Lawn focus area, surprise, surprise, their primary focus was on International Chimney and Darling. And that they, at the time, it, quote, represented this exciting opportunity to greatly improve existing parkland, to create new housing that was close to and supported Main Street, that housing should be in an attractive setting, and that it should have this interplay between housing and parkland that creates a vibrant, compatible neighborhood. So then they get into use density and design principles with the R3M, and they say that, again, a variety of housing should be considered, that it shouldn't all just be big boxes, that, again, this idea of these quality open spaces and public streets is important, that there should be somewhere between 4 to 16 dwelling units per acre in 1 to 3 stories, and the same basic principles of the NMU. So then again, using Drexel Hill and Georgetown as an example, it's sort of an existing R3M. So are we transitioning to something that we already have, or we're past it? And so originally, the R3M before 2015 had very limited Euclidean statements, primarily just whatever was allowed in R3 was allowed in R3M, including multiple families, as long as the lots were large enough to accommodate them. And they had this metric of 7,500 square feet for the first 2 units, 2,500 square feet for each additional unit beyond 2. And so to sort of as a double check, I used Drexel Hill again and Georgetown. I said, okay, 156 units. So I get 7,500 square feet of property for the first 2, 2,500 for each 154 after that. I would be required to have a property that was at least 9 acres based on the R3M at the time. And interestingly, it's actually 10.4. So probably pretty close. And you'll see that it's about 15 to 17 units per acre is allowed, which is consistent with the high end of what was being recommended for the R3M in the comp plan. Georgetown Apartments, same kind of equation. You end up with a required 10.6. They have 11.8. So there again, I'm within 1 acre of what's there. So it's likely that these things were developed with much the same thought process. And again, they're in that sort of 15.5 to 17 units per acre allowed. So it seems that if we're going to propose an update to this code that's going to be as dense or more so, then we really should be on that higher end of that 4 to 16 that was recommended in the comp plan. So I'm going to say that if I'm writing this code, I'm going to be targeting that 15 to 17 units per acre because I don't want to be any less than what we have right now. So interestingly, I'm going to pick on Blocher because I'm very familiar with it, as are most of you. And I want to, there was a lot of discussion about, was Blocher appropriate? Was it consistent? Was it villagey enough, so to speak? Was it the right thing in the right place? And so just looking at it from a density point of view, I'm not going to, sway anyone's opinion one way or the other, but just purely answering that question from a density point of view. Did the codes that we have get it right, or did it not? And should the codes require something that needs to be changed, let's say? So in the comprehensive plan, the NMU was 1 to 3 stories without a floor area ratio, but earlier I decided let's call it 0.5. Seemed like a reasonable assumption. So that would get me 3 12,000 square foot 2-story buildings, or 3 8,100 square foot 3-story buildings. Either it's a big footprint or it's a tall building, and it would result in about 18.5 to 19 units per acre. So the question is that too dense or not dense enough? From the R3M perspective, again, 1 to 3 stories in this 4 to 16 unit per acre scenario. Currently, the existing building is only about 8 units per acre. So we're probably going to target that 90 and push upwards with that, because otherwise it's just not dense enough. Drexel Hill and Georgetown, as we said, have that 15 to 17 ratio and an existing 0.3. And it seems that if we try to stay there, we can get a reasonable number of units and a reasonable square footage of units based on the units per acre metric. But based on the floor area ratio, it's way too low and probably not worthy of redevelopment. So then, interestingly, comparing all of that with where Blocher is today, Blocher is 3 2-story buildings, 10,000 square feet or less in square footage, 93 units, including the existing building. And it has a floor area ratio just shy of 0.5, and it has a unit per acre count of 16.5. So arguably speaking, it's falling in the sweet spot of all the metrics that were discussed in the comprehensive plan, and it generally aligns itself in some forms or another with existing multifamily that's along Evans. So the question becomes in sort of like the next project, and in thinking about what's in these codes as we move forward tonight, is like, what really caused people to get so upset about Blocher? Because from a quantity of units point of view, it actually isn't really that dense in the grand scheme of things and is pretty much consistent with what we already have. So something clearly is broken in the NMU standard that the community either didn't understand or doesn't want to understand, that we need to think about moving forward. So again, philosophies behind the codes. Both codes have similar underlying philosophies because they are remarkably the same. Both are form-based like the NMU, and in fact, the NMU and the R3M are the redheaded stepchildren of the MU. MU was written first by a consultant, and then each subsequent chapter was written in-house at Village Hall, editing down from the MU. And the idea being that NMU is a step lower than MU, and R3M is theoretically a step lower, or at least step sideways from the NMU. Again, reiterating it kind of, we know where these things are located in the village. And the real key here is that in the design objectives of the NMU, it relates directly to these elements that have been discussed in the community plans. And it requotes these design principles that we talked about verbatim. Same with—
Matt, I have a question.
Yeah.
So the NMU, you're saying that right now there is no percentage requirement in there?
There is no floor area ratio requirement. That was not adopted into the MU, and then subsequently, because the two are related to one another, that it doesn't carry through. The only requirement, we'll talk about it, the only requirements are square footage.
Yeah, there's really no floor area ratios anywhere in the zoning code.
Right.
They're discussed in the comp plan in a couple different places, but they were never—
the only reason I asked that question is that if you notice, Drexel Hill and Georgetown are both setback, and there must have been some setback requirement.
Right.
But under the current rules, it looks like they could add buildings towards Evans.
If they can accommodate the parking, yes.
Yeah, and not only could they, to comply with the NMU design standards, because that's the NMU district, they'd have to.
Right.
Or seek a variance, or which they might do.
So you're suggesting that the ratio then?
I'm suggesting the ratio, and I'm using that as a metric because that's where the community plan, that's where all these codes come from, is this conversation from the community plan. But it's an easy enough way of comparing and contrasting divergent developments in a way that kind of boils it down. The interesting thing about the floor area ratio, and like I say, it's an archaic form, but the one thing that the MU, and then subsequently these two other chapters sort of shy away from is the conversation about maximum density or maximum development density. The MU district talks about the idea of having multiple buildings on one site. But as we talked about last month, the interesting thing about Main Street is most sites aren't large enough to accommodate more than one building. So
Right.
not a lot of effort was put into the concept of multiple building properties, primarily because most properties are too small. The first mistake I found when I started working on Blocher is that the properties on Evans in particular are so massive, they couldn't be anything other than multiple building properties. And so in truth, in particular in the NMU, I'm jumping ahead here, but there's 100% lot coverage permitted in the NMU. So I could theoretically take, like, let's say Georgetown and mow 12 acres of property down to the ground, and then put in as many 10,000 square foot, 2 to 3 story buildings that I can accommodate parking in on that 12-acre property, and go bang, 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 property line to property line.
Right.
And the question becomes whether or not that is what was envisioned.
Right.
Is that the goal?
So if you did amend it and put the ratio in, then as they stand right now, they wouldn't be allowed to expand.
Not necessarily. I mean, because keep in mind too that part of the reason that these things were created was to encourage an improvement in density, because we are predominantly built out, right? So the hope would be the only way to put more residents in the village is either to have everybody renting out their upper bedroom, or to put in more apartments or townhouses or something, or have a mix of opportunities for housing. So, I would probably encourage a Georgetown to say put in, or a Drexel to put in, say, townhomes along Evans, let's say, for example.
Right.
But I wouldn't necessarily encourage them to put 10,000 square foot apartment buildings on that property.
Right. Okay.
You know?
Okay, I
So
didn't
one
mean
of
to
the-
interrupt you, but
The
okay.
interesting things about that, though, the density issue, is if you look at the population of the village of Williamsville after the last 40 years, it's decreased not insignificantly. I mean, the peak population in the village was over 7,000 people in like 1970 or something like that. And it's down to 5 or something. The problem with increasing density today as opposed to back then is, I think, or at least one of the problems, or one of the perceived problems, is not necessarily the people, it's the cars.
Right.
Households were bigger back then, and not everybody had a car for every person in the household. But at any rate, I digress.
Well, so
I don't think that's the objection that anybody had with Blocher. It had less to do with
No,
massing
no.
and density. It had a lot more to do with the form of ownership,
yeah,
and you can't regulate that.
right. So getting into the standards then, doing the same sort of comparison as I did with NMU, there's a handful of triggers. Interestingly, that same weird error in the MU that registers a new curb cut as requiring 100% of the document to be applicable to your project permeates into the NMU and the R3M, but everything else is pretty standard and generally makes sense. The introductions of both are almost verbatim. The only thing difference is the NMU talks about strengthening the street wall and focusing circulation on pedestrians, primarily because the NMU has a commercial aspect where the R3M is staying exclusively residential. The other thing is they have, slightly different permitted uses. R3M does permit everything that occurs in R3, including single and 2-family housing. But what's interesting is that the design standards we're going to review tonight do not apply to single and 2-family homes. They only apply to the multifamily commercial developments. So again, my favorite page in these things is the summary up front, which makes a designer's life easy, except that these don't. So NMU has the same basic setbacks that the MU has. R3M, interestingly, omits this 11 to 20 feet with approved open space, primarily because they're not focusing on the idea of commercial, but they do reiterate the idea that the principal building should be consistent with the frontage within 200 feet of the property. What's interesting about that for me is, and particularly in discussion with NMU, for example, because Blocher very much had issues with setback, and ultimately the buildings ended up being approximately the average setback of the buildings 200 feet in either direction. So a question I might have, in looking at these things is NMU and R3M really that different, or are there parts of one that should be applied to the other and vice versa to kind of, address these things? Or are there things with residential only buildings that make more sense, like being pushed back to match the houses, as opposed to a commercial property, which probably wants to be, with storefronts on the street? And maybe there needs to be a differentiation there. The other thing that's interesting is that R3M, which was primarily written right around the time that Darling was moving out and Natalia was moving in, makes specific reference to abutting open space and public land, and in fact allows a building to be within 10 feet of that land. This is interestingly contradictory to the idea of improving parkland, at least in my opinion, because I feel like it creates a wall along the edge of the park as opposed to expanding that park. It also is contradictory to the idea that both of these zones are meant to have this publicly accessible space in the form of some form of parkland, and here we are putting a wall on the property line. The other thing is that the text of this summary is actually contradictory to the text of the code. So that's a trip hazard. I'm just warning you now that it is the text of the code that matters, not the summary. But the contradiction is that in the first one, it says 0 to 10 feet, when in fact it is not 0, it is simply 10. The other thing that is curious to me about this is that in every other scenario, the rear yard setback for one of these buildings is 20 to 40 feet where it abuts a district boundary. And yet for some reason, we can encroach incredibly farther onto open space and parkland. There's also a typo here on the parking lot setback in the summary of the NMU. It's contradictory to the text of the code. We don't have to get into the specifics of it, but just a fair warning about that. The other thing I wanted to point out is the parking. So NMU has exactly the same parking metrics as MU, with 1.5 per 1,000 square feet of leasable space and 1.5 per residential unit. Interestingly, the R3M, which is specifically geared to residential exclusively, has a 1 per unit and 10% additional per unit total. So for 100 units, that's 150 stalls in the NMU, but 110 in the R3M, if I built the exact same building. Now, what's really interesting about that is that Blocher, for example, was a purely residential property, and we had to get a parking variance from the NMU design standards because we didn't need that much parking. And in fact, we would not have needed that variance at all had we been in R3M. So I guess here again, the question becomes, with these things having been written as sort of, again, the stepchildren of one to the next, to the next, to the next, and we've sort of losing things off the horse cart as we go, the question is there something that should come from one and go to the other? Should we be focusing, should we differentiating again on that idea of the mixed use building versus the purely residential building? And should there be some relief in some of these things? It's another thing to consider also when weighing the idea of variances for parking, for example, in one of these zones, is that there is this interesting dichotomy that I could build the same building on a different property and end up with a different requirement. Building heights, very, very different. So again, this idea that the MU is the densest commercial mixed use property, NMU is a step down from that, a little bit more residential friendly and a little bit more peripheral, but still that idea of mix of uses. And then the R3M being this multifamily. What's interesting is that the NMU has a minimum of 2 stories, just like MU, but it has a 36-foot maximum height, which is shorter than Main Street zonings. And it has a 20-foot setback step back requirement. R3M has an allowable by right 3 usable stories, with an overall maximum of 36 feet. So theoretically, you can get the same building in both, but I can assure you that getting a third story from West Stone in an NMU district is really hard to do these days. So that was a joke, by the way. But what's interesting is that if I put a huge peaked roof on my building in the R3M, I can actually get a fourth floor in there and be taller up to 40 feet. Now, the other thing is this has my favorite typo in it, measured Rot-He midpoint. And that permeates throughout the entire document. We'll come back to that.
That damn Microsoft Publisher.
Yeah, that's what
software.
I keep hearing. Yep. So building coverage. So this comes back to Rick's question earlier. The only building coverage requirement is a square footage requirement per story. So MU allows 15,000 square feet for a building footprint. Both NMU and R3M were downsized to 10,000 gross square feet per story. NMU has 100% lot coverage where R3M does not. It does not talk about density per acre or any other metric to that extent. The other thing is that NMU has a transparency requirement for the commercial zones. So doing a quick comparison through the chapters, rather than going through the site design example like I did last time, I just put all three of these things head to head because we've already gone through ad nauseum the NMU. And so really the goal here is to just show you what changed. So as you go from NU to NMU, the only thing that really changes is references to Main Street. It eliminates some of the requirements for transparency in the R3M because it's not focused on commercial. And it adds this 20-foot to 40-foot setback for a district boundary, except for open space where you're allowed to be this 0 to 10-foot dimension, which is again contradictory to another clause later on. Site planning and design for vehicle circulation, drive-throughs and driveways and things. These things are all copied verbatim from one to the next. The big difference is R3M skips drive-in facilities because it's just not a commercial zoning. It's not appropriate. So then site infrastructure and facilities, loading, service, maintenance, refuse, screen infrastructure, utilities, all these things carry straight through with the exception of some clauses that drop off that again, sort of relate to non-applicable uses or commercial spaces that aren't appropriate by the zone. Parking. This one really drives me crazy. So location, shared parking, massing orientation, and other parking considerations. All these things that we talked about last month with this theoretical new development at Young's Plaza there. All those requirements about that green space and the orientation of the parking relative to the building and the parking rooms and the geometry of all these things, they are all but completely omitted from the NMU, almost completely. Though interestingly, later on, other clauses that refer back to those sections were not edited out. So there's references to portions of the code that no longer exist because they were copied directly out of the MU district. But there's no requirement for parking lot massing. There's no requirement for green space. There's no requirement for parking rooms. There's no requirement for even shared parking on the property. And then the only real change to the R3M from the NMU is that all of those things remain substantially removed, but then they also reduce the parking requirements. So the other thing is the NMU omits snow storage requirements, which the MU requires. Though oddly enough, one of the village's site plan submittal requirements in chapter 112 is to indicate the snow storage areas on your site plan. So even though MU reiterates that, NMU eliminates that, elsewhere in the code, it puts it back in again. So there's this real sort of, sloppiness that starts to occur here. And I gotta be honest with you, by the time we get to R3M, I'm really not complimentary of this chapter. MU landscaping. We talked a lot about that crazy metric of plant units and what's required for parking lot landscaping and what's required for foundation treatments and buffers and screening. And then you get to NMU, you're not required to do any parking lot landscaping. It's completely omitted. And then you get to R3M, you're also not required to do any foundation treatments. And you're not required to provide any buffers or screens. And yet, when you read the comprehensive plan, when you read the overview text, which is copied verbatim from MU. It talks about, you know, being green, and it talks about heat island effects and the benefits of buffers and screening and you know, carefully designed landscapes, and it even, you know, goes so much further to talk about the idea that both NMU and R3M are supposed to have these sensitively knitted, you know, developments into the community and these public open spaces, and yet they're not requiring a tree to be planted in the parking lot. And in the NMU, again, 100% lot coverage, I can theoretically pave property line to property line. I don't have to plant a damn tree. Feels like again, something fell off the horse cart along the way here. So really quick review of my really quick review for chapters A through E. The big thing to take away here is that the mixed use written by a consultant gets rewritten into the NMU, dumbed down a little bit, and then gets rewritten again into the R3M, dumbed down further. But along the way, editing has left some clauses and omitted others without sufficient alternative requirements. There are figures and images that were swapped out of the image gallery in each of these documents that were intended to be more appropriate to the topic, but then captions were either poorly edited or completely miscoordinated with the image. They refer to some other image from some other document. And Chip will again assert that this is because of using Microsoft Publisher, but I would say that the software is only as good as its user. And recently, following all the fallout from Blocher.
By the way.
What's that?
Which wasn't me, by the way.
Yeah, and it wasn't Chip, by the way. The village board, some members of the village board have talked about the idea of studying the NMU and the R3M in greater detail based on what happened with Natalia and Blocher. And however, the interesting thing that I would offer, and Chip mentioned this too, is that in looking at our village map and our zoning map, there are a very few future opportunities for new development, short of raising entire developments and starting over. With the exception of Rick's point, where a Drexel Hill or a Georgetown might pursue the idea of increasing the number of units they have on the property simply by putting them along the street, assuming they could accommodate the parking. So some interesting things to think about. Are there any questions at this point before we move on?
Maybe a short comment.
Okay.
I think that possibly that some of the issues with landscaping and parking lots and all the rest was to get away from parking minimums and to allow more building massing and less parking. And when you have a far less parking, the objective was to take what little parking you have and maximize the use for cars in those small areas. I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't involved with it. It's conjecture on my part, but that may be part of the reason why it came that way, in an effort to promote walkability and larger building massing closer to the street and de-emphasize parking. That was the trade-off potentially.
Yeah, and I think that is largely true in the MU district, Bill, and I think also when you consider the type of again, the size of the properties that we're talking about in like the MU district, or even to that extent, the small sort of postage stamp properties that are along South Long, that makes a valid amount of sense. Because I mean, paving a 10,000 square foot parcel and allowing a 10,000 square foot building to be built on it are effectively the same. On the other hand, and I've been saying this for about a year now, the truth of the matter is that the most developable area of the NMU district, and to a lesser extent, let's say the Darling property with the R3M, were these massive conjoined parcels measured in multiple acres. And so the idea that we're de-emphasizing the parking and, you know, lowering those standards is one thing, but also at the same time allowing literally paving paradise on a 5 or 10 acre parcel just doesn't make any sense. So I feel like there may have been, let's say, triggers or trip hazards along the way that were missed or not considered in the proper scaling of these documents to future developments. I mean, because I gotta believe that no one's gonna want, let's say, the tennis center to be turned over to 100% paved property with no trees and no green space in the future. It doesn't make a lot of sense, particularly nestled into the neighborhood and surrounded by Amherst State Park.
Right.
Any other questions or comments? All right, moving on. So then the last two chapters to talk about are chapters F and G. And these are these architectural chapters, these building design chapters. Everything before had been sort of site plan. So before 2015, there were no design standards for multifamily dwellings, multifamily residents, and it shows. This is the real reason why R3M was rewritten. It's not that we created a new zone like with the NMU. It was that we were attempting to avoid projects like we have near Village Hall on South Cayuga there, being these Lego block buildings that are self-containing pods surrounding surface parking that's up at the street, and it's the first thing you see. It was, coming from the comp plan, they were envisioning the exact opposite, inverting this whole development, bringing it out to the street, integrating into the neighborhood as opposed to isolating it. The idea that those parking facilities should be behind the buildings, not in front of them, like they are at Georgetown and Drexel. The idea that they should have these public components to them, that they should address the public realm, and the frontage should be welcoming and have these porches and draw you into the building as opposed to these flat edifices. And again, those key characteristics that were iterated from the comp plan was the idea of multi-story buildings and building edges and ground floor facades that were welcoming and mixes of uses, and these architectural styles that are handed down to the village through history. Arguably speaking, the property on South Cayuga has certainly been handed down to us through history. It's probably 50 years old, but it is not something I think that anyone would really want to emulate or repeat. Georgetown arguably has at least a little more sensitivity with some architectural style and things, but still, has a somewhat dated appearance, and there might be something that could be done with that. So the idea was then to adopt these architectural design standards so that we would avoid these hazards in the future, right? So in the MU, what we talked about was all these building forms and massing and proportions and scales and building square footages and breaking the facades up when they were wider than 50 feet and these 600 square foot compositions to break down the facade further and whatnot. NMU reduces the size of the square footage from 15 to 10. It substantially the same as far as all the other clauses, but it eliminates any references to Main Street for obvious reasons. It eliminates the minimum first floor height. It does create a 20-foot maximum height instead of 30 when it's abutting a residential district within 20 feet. It also talks nothing about step back, so it doesn't envision a building tall enough that would require a step back on the back of the building like MU did. It also allows planning board the discretion to have one-story additions on the rear and sides of existing buildings at your discretion. And again, you know how I love these discretionary clauses. This would be an opportunity for an applicant, I think, to come to a work session or a sketch plan opportunity to discuss, would you be deferential to the idea of a one-story addition rather than letting them get all the way through site plan first. And then it reiterates some things about these correlations of multiple storefronts, again, because its focus is similarly on this mixed-use commercial storefront like MU is. R3M, on the other hand, whacks out basically the entire building form and massing requirement. It doesn't need to relate to the proportion, massing, or scale of surrounding historic forms. It changes the allowable height considerably from the NMU and allows taller structures that are pushed much deeper into the lot while simultaneously having the same maximum height within 20 feet of a residential district. But it also allows those bigger buildings to theoretically encroach within 10 feet of open space, but again, at a maximum height of 20 feet. So there's this odd thing that, again, stuff's starting to fall off the horse cart here. Certain things are being added in, which makes sense. Other things are being omitted, which I don't know what the rationale is. Moving forward, so then talking about building height, I figured this graphic might help a little bit to sort of explain where we're at. So MU and NMU both have a minimum 2-story requirement. Got to put in 2 stories. The first floor level of MU is required to be 15 feet. Other districts are not. Now, the maximum building height for MU is allowed to be 50 feet. So that's roughly a tall 3-story, a short 4-story building. NMU allows up to 36 feet. And R3M also allows up to 36 feet if you're doing a 3-story building. But it also allows a 4-story building if you build it to 40 feet measured Rahi midpoint of the roof ridge. So first things first, I'm not saying that this is exactly what it's supposed to say, but in my interpretation, that's supposed to say to a point halfway between the eave and ridge, because it's the only thing that makes sense. Can't be a midpoint of a roof ridge. A roof ridge is a constant elevation. The other thing is that there's a spectacular typo here. It should be built, not build. But by and large, you get a building that looks kind of sort of like the one on the right, where you'd have this pseudo half story that could be up to 10 feet tall. Your building height then, to be that high, would mean that your ridge height is 50 feet. So in theory, you're going to this R3M because it's a multi-family residential. It's supposed to be knitted into the fabric of the existing neighborhood, which apparently is very valuable and well loved by the residents. And yet I'm allowed to build a building whose ridge height is exactly the same as a 4-story building on Main Street. Better yet, I'm allowed to do this in the rear yard of a large parcel that allows multiple buildings. And I'm theoretically able to push that up to 20 feet in front of a residential boundary or a parkland. So here's the thing though, there's a subtlety built into this that says that you're allowed to have a building that's 20 feet tall at 10 to 20 feet from parkland or residential district boundary, that you actually need to be 40 feet tall, 40 feet away to have a building that's 40 feet tall. So this is an interesting thing that I wanted to draw out, specifically because, again, in talking about the open space zoning that we're proposing to rewrite, that we've talked about recently, and also in the underlying comprehensive plan philosophy that these R3M zones and the South Long focus area was an opportunity to sensitively knit these new higher density housing styles into the parkland, strengthening the park and having this share of spaces and publicly open spaces. I would question then how it is that Natali is building 3-story buildings along the rear yard on the Lehigh Trail when no height variance was granted, and there was a waiver for square footage to actually reduce the height to get it down to 3 stories, but all 3 of these buildings are between 10 and 17 feet from the property line, and all of them are taller than 20 feet. So the trouble that I have with our code is that these types of little trip hazards, these little granules of information get overlooked by the designer, by our code enforcement, and even by our planning board members, because there's so much baked into these codes and every one of them looks very similar, but they're not all exactly the same. And there's lots of very little subtleties in here that everybody has to be vaguely aware of. I would argue that what Natali has proposed and is currently constructing actually violates the code as written, but it's been granted a site plan approval and it's moving forward. Had they been obliged to meet this, they probably would have canned the project too, because they would have lost a considerable quantity of housing units on the backside of these buildings. They probably only would have been able to do 2-story building, at least on the backside. They could have maybe stepped up to a front 3rd story if they wanted to, but it's all conjecture. But it's an interesting study to compare what's been granted versus what's actually required. Architectural consistency. Commercial building character, everything from MU carries directly over to the NMU. And there's no reference to it in R3M because it's commercial is not permitted. Residential building character. So MU goes ad nauseum about traditional forms, solid to void ratios, porch enclosures, and all of that carries directly over to NMU, where it's copied essentially verbatim, except, again, my favorite snafu, clause F simply gets cut off the end of the sentence. We don't know what they're going to distinguish that visual separation from, but based on the text of the MU, I'm guessing it's the street. Similarly, in R3M, that clause does come back to life. It doesn't get cut off, and it does say the street, so I'm guessing that's what it's supposed to be. But more concerning is that the entire clause from MU and NMU regarding traditional forms and solid to void ratios is completely omitted from the R3M. So the whole reason this thing was written was to provide design standards for multifamily housing because we didn't have any. And now the one chapter that talks consistently and intentionally about residential building character actually omits the character that the comp plan, the NMU, and the MU all bash over your head, even though the overview text is copied verbatim and regurgitates that same philosophy. So there's a disconnect in the R3M's codified requirements versus the subjective narrative requirements. Architectural detailing, essentially all the same. The only big difference is omission of commercial in the R3M. And then there's yet another irregularity in that conversation regarding roofs and cornices and eaves, overhangs and parapets, these sort of architectural elements that are meant to cap off a building and create, a sense of permanence and completion at the top of the building, is completely omitted again. So those Lego block buildings that we don't like on South Cayuga across from Village Hall could be created again in the future in an R3M because there is no mandate for them to have any ornamentation at the top of the building. Architectural details, building doors and entries, building materials, copied verbatim to NMU, and then completely omitted again from R3M. No sense of place, no welcoming entrance, no drawing you in is required on a residential multifamily building. The only other thing that's different is the building materials. For some reason, the only thing that they seem to care about, and the authors cared about in the R3M, was that you're not allowed to use decorative split face or textured masonry materials on a residential building, but you can in the other two districts. Why that is pertinent as opposed to, say, I don't know, a parapet, I don't know. Lastly, coming to the end of the chapters, we have signage, lighting, and seasonal outdoor seating, which are very specific to their various zones. The signage will be covered under a separate chapter. Lighting only is verbatim from MU, all the requirements for lighting for light standards and wall lighting. And then seasonal outdoor only applies to the NMU district anyway. So, quick review of chapters F and G. Again, MU begets NMU begets R3M. And I pose this question. If existing multifamily units were boxy, unattractive, institutional, uninspired, and lacking in character, if historic forms are truly valued throughout all these standards as they claim they are, if our residents are almost universally content with existing residential neighborhoods and preserving 1 and 2 family neighborhoods is central to the quality of the life, then why do the R3M standards digress so far from these required forms, massings, characters, and facade detailing and site landscaping? Shouldn't it actually require more sensitivity, not less? So, summarizing, went through the comprehensive plan, basis of the code, just like it is for the MU. The code is what matters, though. Those pedestrians and historic values and forms and massings and complementary compositions are again beaten on your head through every page of this code until you get to R3M. Are the differences and I don't know the answer to these, are rhetorical questions, are the differences that exist between the NMU and the R3M what the comp plan intended. Intended that there be an availability of commercial in one and a purely residential in the other, but the other differences that start to fall off the horse cart along the way, are these also what was intended in the comprehensive plan? The architectural design standards permit originality and resourcefulness to the designer. But are we going to get originality and resourcefulness, or are we going to get Lego boxes? Planning board is responsible to know and implement this code. Zoning board is responsible to know and grant variances to this code. Based on what I presented tonight, my question to you, and I'm not looking for you to answer it tonight, it's more of a homework assignment. Would planning board, would zoning board recommend changes to these codes based on what you've seen both in adjudicating projects like Asher Crossing, projects like Bloker, as well as just this, sort of sarcastic peeling apart and of these, these code statements to ask these sort of hard questions. How did we get here? Are we where we want to be? And is this what we want in the future? Questions?
Yeah, man, I had the question about the 3-story buildings. Once in a while I take my dog down that bike path there, and I was concerned of that also. I mean, just the philosophy of the village has always been open space and recreational areas, and then to see that 3-story building being, like you said, 10 to 20 feet from the bike path, it was kind of alarming, I guess. And the zoning board had nothing to do with that project, I don't believe. And so,
I checked.
I just wasn't sure what was going on with it. That's my question also. I mean, I was just concerned that at first I thought they were part of the condos, 1-story or 2-story, but then I found out they were the 3-story. I said, man, that is pretty close to that bike path. I don't even know if I'd want to live there and be that close to that bike path, but that's not, obviously.
Well, theoretically, it should be desirable to live there and be close to the bike path. The question is whether or not they're, in its built form, are we ending up with something that is mutually beneficial on both sides of the line?
Right.
Or if we have something that is uniquely beneficial to one side.
Right. Agreed.
Matt, I have a question.
Sure.
It seems like there's a lot of inconsistencies in these various, you point out all the differences in these things. So how do you fix it? Do you just make up, what's the end game, I guess,
Well, part of fixing it is educating everyone on these inconsistencies. But when it comes down to the implementation of it, it comes down to a question of the applicant and what is actually written and what isn't, how far you can push the applicant to meet the spirit of the law, which is at least regurgitated over and over in these documents. Ultimately, to fix it, so to speak, would be to amend it. And that's a process that can be done, and we're doing on multiple chapters, and Chip's eyes are, bugging out of his head right now at the idea of me amending yet another chapter of our zoning code. But the real question is whether or not the amendments to it, first, whether or not the code is written is consistent with the comprehensive plan. And if it isn't, the question is, do we amend it to be consistent with the comprehensive plan? Or is the comprehensive plan so old that it needs to be rewritten first, and then amendments made to that revision? And all of these things take an extraordinary amount of time and a lot of money. And in fact, the reason we have the documents we have is that the village is not flush with cash. And the first one was done by a consultant for something like $35,000. And the subsequent two after that were done in-house, quote unquote, on the cheap, right? And unfortunately, I feel like whoever was doing the editing got their big eraser out for the R3M, and I don't know there's no, at least not that I'm aware of, sort of documentation as to how the decision was made to continue erasing and eliminating certain clauses that oddly enough seem more applicable than others.
When
So
was the comp plan done? What year was that?
comp plan was originally written in 2010, and it is actually due for a rewrite, but there again, it was a project that I tried to do last year, but it is so monumental and we do not have the in-house staff to do it that, and I'm certainly not going to do it as a weekend warrior. We need to hire a consultant to actually do it properly.
It was, and as Matt said, so it was adopted in 2010, and that was a long process. Some of the people on this call were involved in that process, and that was done with several consultants in adopting the comp plan. And then the MU standards were adopted relatively soon thereafter, also using a consultant, as Matt indicated. That was, there was a $35,000 budget for that project. The comp plan was amended at the time the NMU and R3M design standards were adopted in 2015. But again, that was done solely in-house, no consultants were involved. And I think that is, part of the reason that those documents are probably not as internally consistent and maybe not as consistent with the comp plan as the earlier NMU is. Although I'll say that I think with respect to the NMU, I don't, because the NMU, I think more simply than the R3M was, the attempt there was simply to do essentially, if you will, an MU light, basically just scale everything down a little bit. And I think it pretty much did that. I think that what was not considered, and this has been mentioned before, but what was not really considered in that process, and that I think a consultant may have a planning consultant may have latched onto and pointed out, is that you have two NMU districts that involve properties that are wildly different in scale and size. So the South Long NMU district is a bunch of very small, typical village-sized parcels, and the Evans Street NMU are the largest parcels in the village. So it does.
Interestingly, I pointed out at a planning board meeting recently that the entire South Long neighborhood NMU district can fit on the Blocher property
Probably comfortably.
with room to spare.
Yeah. So that's sort of an anomaly on that. The R3M, I think that was probably rushed a bit, and that was largely because for the first time, I've been the village attorney since 2008. We have had, both before and after those design standards were adopted, we've had exactly one R3M project in the village, and that was Natali. There's just not that, but that property had been rezoned to that, and there was a great deal of concern about, we need to have some design standards in place for that, or they'll just be able to build whatever, those Lego blocks. But as Matt's presentation, I think, points out, it may, or, people can agree or disagree whether those design standards were successful in terms of what the end result was with Natali. But what I do think Matt's presentation demonstrates is, regardless of how you feel about the architecture or the massing of Natali, there's problems with those R3M design standards. And it really is kind of odd that you can build bigger and closer to other properties in the R3M than you can in the NMU. And I really do think that was largely because when those were designed and when they were drafted, there was a specific project that was kind of lurking there. And so that was a specific piece of property, and an unusual piece of property, and a pretty big piece of property that led to or influenced how that came out. but probably not too much thought, if any, as to how that would apply on other R3M parcels.
I think that's probably true, but it was also, let's face it, the reality was that a lot of development companies were solicited for those properties to say and encourage people to come in and change them from industrial uses into more residential uses on the promise that you'd get very high density and you could afford to pay a lot of money for those pieces because you were going to get a good return on the density that you were going to be given back on the backside. And that became Natale's biggest problem, was that after he had paid a lot, then he got caught up in all kinds of issues with the neighborhood and people not wanting that kind of density and all the rest. So I think there's a couple issues that are at play here. The first thing is those sorts of areas of the code that are in conflict with one another, tables versus the text of the body of the sections, those typos, those kind of things need to be corrected immediately, not waiting for other, loftier goals. You can't have a code sitting out there with inconsistencies within it and areas that are in conflict with one another, and then expect people to be able to comply with it, or for the code enforcement officials to regulate it properly. Those things need to be fixed instantly, as quickly as possible. The second issue is the larger, loftier goal of what do we want to be, and saying, how should these be revised? An update is coming, comprehensive, and the things that Matt talked about. Do you want to amend the comprehensive plan to make it more in conflict, more compatible with the ideas and objectives that are written into a code, or do you want to change the code to make it compatible with the existing form of the comprehensive plan? In the end, they need to be consistent with one another, and I think those kind of things have to take place. But that's the business of codes, and recognize also that places change over time, right? New York City wasn't always 50 to 80 story buildings. There was a time when there were much smaller buildings there. And over time, as land becomes more, as an area is desirable, and as land becomes more and more expensive, the only way people can afford to live there is for the density to increase over time. Now, I'm not suggesting we have to go from 2-story buildings to 60-story buildings overnight. It's a process of evolving over time, but clearly that's the sort of thing that happened with Asher Crossing in those areas, and is happening with really on some level Blocher. There's a recognition that some of these areas need to evolve and change as with the times. So, that's the larger goal of a comprehensive plan committee, and looking at the things that the village has always been good at doing, and that you guys have done a pretty decent job of leading the public through. So, but fixing the conflict areas in the code, that typos, that needs to be done immediately.
Matt, you're muted.
There you go. Wouldn't unmute. I was gonna say, guess we have to teach Keaton how to use Microsoft Publisher.
Or put a totally new plan. God, we got to get rid of these publishers. That's the other thing I really would like to see, those design standards somehow imported into a different software.
Sure. Anybody else? All right, well, that's it for me. I understand there's a football game tonight.
Yeah, so I just want to confirm that, I do have a presentation I've prepared for open meetings law stuff, but we can definitely do that at another meeting. And I think Tim would confirm this, that I think we're probably going to have a pretty quiet winter in terms of agendas for these boards. So we'll have time to do the open meeting stuff and get another hour in at another meeting.
Yeah,
And I still have a sign code to review too.
Right now,
Yes.
yeah, I have nothing pending for January, so we could do it in January too. So we'll see. We got a little more time before the deadline. So
I'm fine with doing another hour if we have to, but I think even it was few people noted that we had done 3 hours last time. This hour gives us 4 already. So.
Well, so then that cuts for this year, and now we got to do it for next year.
I'm fine with that. As long as I don't miss kickoff, I'm good.
I think I'm good for the evening. I'm already beat. So
Great job, Matt. Good.
Thanks, Kevin.
Well, very well.
Very good job,
Definitely.
Matt. Very
Nice
good.
job, Matt.
Merry
All right.
Christmas, everybody. Happy
Happy
holidays.
Merry
holidays,
Christmas.
to everybody. Happy New Year.
See you next
See you.
year.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.